What I'm going to cover today is some sort of our latest thoughts on carbon removals and the opportunities that they create, both for landholders, for the ag sector, for businesses, but more broadly just for the climate overall. Like the reason that we're trying to create these markets and implement these incentive mechanisms is that we want to do something about climate change, and well, specifically we want to mitigate and minimize climate change and hopefully get climate unchanged. Sadly, we're a pretty long way from that at the moment with the news in the Northern Hemisphere about these extreme heat waves, which are basically terrifying. But like at the moment, we're still going very much in the wrong direction. There's lots of signs of improvement, but we need to figure out a way to speed it up. And carbon removals and voluntary carbon markets and compliance carbon markets are a big part of that. As Wim said, I lead the sort of product and engineering at CarbonCrop, where I'm a co-founder, and we've been implementing forest carbon solutions, especially for landholder market access, using AI. We're a spin out of the Nelson Artificial Intelligence Institute. With all that background out of the way, so this is the broader goal. Like I'm going to talk a lot about specific markets and standards and everything else, but in principle, there's roughly 1 billion hectares of marginal land on the planet which is not currently forested, could be forested, and is not in competition with agricultural production, and is assessed that if it were all forested, then it could draw down on the order of 5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. So this is in addition to all of the carbon dioxide that we could draw down through better management and restoration of existing forest land. The true number is hopefully somewhere well above 5 billion tonnes in terms of what we can achieve. But 5 billion is kind of our pole star, like I should say, Southern Cross, given where we are, but that's what we're working towards. This is why we bother, because putting that in context, global emissions today are on the order of sort of 40, 45-ish, 50 gigatons per year. So this is not going to solve climate change. We need to massively decarbonize and reduce emissions. But as you'll see in a couple of slides, we desperately need all of these carbon removals as well. So diving right into that, why bother with removals? This is a chart from the UN. I think it's a year or so old now, but basically it shows these sort of emissions pathways basically. So you can see in this one, we were up around 40-ish gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. And when the chart was created, sadly, we're actually tracking beyond this. This is a low energy demand pathway is what LED means. And this black line is net emissions overall globally, assuming that we hit that pathway. As those of you who've been tracking this, unfortunately, we're not on track for this pathway, but for argument's sake, this is a scenario consistent with keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees C above sort of the pre-industrial revolution state. What's presented here is a bunch of different bunch of different emission categories: electricity, the ubiquitous other category, buildings, transport, industry. Then there's one down the bottom, which is land use. And you'll see that at the moment, land use is actually, it's shown as a source of emissions. What this chart shows is it becoming a source of removals, like negative emissions. It might seem weird that it's a source of emissions at the moment when you consider that trees grow and they store carbon, but unfortunately at the moment we're not storing carbon in forest in aggregate on a global level, and certainly not once we consider agricultural. We're actually losing carbon stocks through forest internationally, and what we need to do is turn that around. Like take what's currently roughly a 5 gigaton source of carbon emissions and turn it into a 5 gigaton carbon sink, so that it can help clean up the mess we've made historically and also start to address some of the mess we're continuing to make. And we need to do this pretty much whatever the pathway is. Like I'll come a little later on to much of the refrain recently around we need to stop focusing on offsets and avoided emissions and and removals, and instead focus on gross emissions reductions. Like we definitely need to focus on gross emissions reductions. Our emissions are far too high, and we don't have any even vaguely credible pathway to mitigating climate change unless we massively decarbonize. But for all of these different, I just picked 4 different scenarios from the UN, all of these pathways also rely on us massively increasing carbon removals in addition to decarbonizing. So there's no pathway left where we stabilize climate change just through decarbonization. We need massive removals. And this is even if you're happy with 1.5C. Like as we're seeing with the climate at the moment, 1.5C is already a disaster. Like we should be aiming to get back to where we were, around 0-ish. We want to get to net negative, but part of that is getting to 0, and the key part is that carbon removals are essential to that. So I'll sort of quickly begin with a bit of background to CarbonCrop within that landscape. Carbon markets exist, and in terms of carbon incentives for forest carbon sequestration, there's sort of a couple of fairly simple components. You've got some CO2, which is in the atmosphere, and you don't want it there. You want it, well, we want some of it there. 350 parts per million would be nice, but we've got too much. We want to suck some of it out of the atmosphere, lock it up in forest. And some landholder of some form, some entity has rights to that forest. If they can get that carbon removal and durable sequestration verified, they get carbon units, which they can sell to a carbon emitter, which means that they receive funds, which means that they've both got the means and an incentive to increase the amount of carbon that they're removing and durably storing. This is the goal. This is how it works when it's working properly. What we found when we started we're doing the research to, is there a problem we can help solve here, is that you've got your landholder and you've got a market. And in many cases in New Zealand, like, the landholders knew that carbon markets were a thing, and they knew that they had some trees. But then they try to access that market and they hit all of these different obstacles around the compliance obligations and costs and risks and modeling. And then it's not just one market, actually, it's three different markets, because there's the compliance market, which people are most familiar with in New Zealand, the ETS. There's also voluntary carbon markets, and there's also net zero product claims you might want to make. And if you're someone who's got a million different things on their plate and you encounter all of these obstacles and you find your way through, as often as not, they were just hitting one of the many obstacles and giving up. And it gets more complicated than that, because landholders generally don't exist in a vacuum, even just them in the market. There's also all of these other stakeholders, like consultants and developers and supply channel partners and businesses looking to make net zero claims. And they're dealing not just with one landholder, but with tens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. And that introduces not just the obstacles that the landholder has, but also all of these other complications around continuity of services and management of engagement and data and a registry and planning and a whole heap more compliance obligations. And in the discussions we had with them, we realized that all of this stuff is being solved at the moment. I mean, this is probably not an exclusive statement, but for the most part, with a combination of sort of emails and phone calls and spreadsheets that are passed back and forth and hand-maintained models, and in many cases, non-compliant financial processes, intermingled customer data, and it's a really big mess. And this is increasing friction and reducing market access, which means that the incentives are less effective, which means that we get less forest, less carbon sucked out of the atmosphere, and basically nobody in the ecosystem gets what they actually want, which is a well-functioning market. So we saw an opportunity for us to create a platform that connected these. We started out mostly by connecting landholders to markets, and we're now in the process of expanding that platform for other participants in the marketplace. We're a technology company and a products company, really. We have been working in the services sector for the last 2 years to get this product up and running, but really now we want to turn it into a platform that everybody in the space can use to help it scale and be most effective. In terms of what we've achieved so far, this is taking up some of what Wim just mentioned. We've mapped the forest and carbon stocks of 1.9 million hectares of New Zealand so far. We're now in the process of dramatically scaling that up. And we've already paid out roughly $25 million in carbon, which has been, in many cases, turned into cash to landholders in New Zealand for their forest. And we've got 265 ETS registrations either completed or in process at the moment, and something like 310 customer contracts, again, still growing. And that's in sort of under 2 years since we really launched the product. That's a bit of background on us. Into carbon markets. So there's compliance and voluntary carbon markets, and I'll try and cover both of them, but a lot of this focuses on the interactions and the relationships between the two. They've both got two key elements, really, though. There's supply. In our ideal world, that's the creation of carbon removals. There are also some variants of supply, which is the creation of avoided emissions, but that has issues, which I'll get to later. And these removers, like I'm calling them removers now, before they were landholders, they create removals. They've got obligations around the quality assurance of those removals, and they need funds, because for the most part, whatever you're doing, generating carbon removals has some opportunity cost of some form, and often some real costs. And so you have to find a way to fund it if you want it to happen and have it happen at scale. On the other side of the relationship, we've got demand, which is from emitters, which have some combination of compliance obligations in the compliance market, or voluntary goals that they've set for themselves and they want a way to achieve. And either way, generally what they need to achieve those goals is removals. And then in between, you have a market which does what pretty much every market since the dawn of civilization does. It looks to connect supply with demand. And what's very interesting, because a lot of people, they know about voluntary carbon markets because that's the thing which is sort of a consumer-facing opportunity and people talk about. What people might not realize is that the global compliance carbon market last year just crossed $100 billion. This is the sort of aggregate taxes or ETS fees collected around the world for carbon for compliance purposes. Like, people don't have an opportunity of whether they participate or not. And it's interesting to look at that in contrast to the voluntary carbon market, which last year, I think last year it might have actually been smaller because of the recession. But either way, it's tiny in comparison. And something like my view on this, and I think it's reasonably widely held, is that voluntary carbon markets will not solve climate change. It would be the same as hoping that like a voluntary tax scheme would provide a government with all of the revenues it needed to run. Like, you get some interaction, but it's always limited. If you want to actually address this 40 gigatons of emissions, either we somehow find a way that it's cheaper to not emit than to emit, or we have to force people to do it. Like, the entire petroleum sector is not just going to voluntarily decarbonize absent incentives. It has to be compliance. And in New Zealand, the ETS, like, for all that it gets its share of criticism and people frustrated with it, it actually does a lot of stuff really well. Like, it has put a price on carbon for most of the New Zealand economy, with the exception of agriculture. And unfortunately, agriculture is something like 48% of our emissions, but still pretty much any activity that you undertake in New Zealand, getting from place to place, running your heater in your house or your office, all of our industrial activity, essentially all of our waste sector, or any forest that you chose to cut down, there's a dollar price that you face for doing that, which means that there's a commercial incentive to not do it, which is what we want. We want people pushed in the direction of using less carbon. But the ETS does also have some issues, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list, and perhaps it's also not an complete one, but key things are that there's no incentives in ag, and incentives go in both directions. Like, in some cases, it might be that there's activities like soil carbon removals that could be incentivized. It's also that there's no price on methane emissions in New Zealand, which means that there's no incentive to deploy a technology which would reduce methane emissions. And this is leaving a lot of options on the table where we could reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. And that's why there's so much work in the sector around Hawake Kanoa and the ag pricing scheme to change this. There's also some very perverse incentives which have come up through the way that some sectors of forestry have been managed, including trees that aren't going in the places that we necessarily want them. And what I'm going to talk about today, most of all, is trees that are in the places that we want them, but we're not incentivizing them, so they're potentially even getting cleared to create space for trees that we don't want. Finally, and I'm not going to get into this today, but I think New Zealand's ambitions are actually pretty decent by international standards, yet at the same time they're woefully insufficient. Like, we've got this goal of 50% reductions by 2030, 100% by 2050, with a little asterisk next to some agriculture and short-lived gases, which is like, we're going to only reduce those 50%. It's clearly not enough. Like, we already have massive climate issues at our current state now in 2023. Only 50% reducing our emissions 7 years from now is a disaster in my view, and I really hope that the sort of ongoing Paris-related agreements are going to lead to some more ambition for goals for all parties. But that's another rant. Given the ETS, a reasonable question would be, what is the point of the voluntary carbon market? In our view, it's to fill these gaps. Like, the ETS does some things well, where it doesn't do things well. That means that in many cases, there's a complete absence of incentive mechanisms. People who are willing to take voluntary action can step in and plug those gaps. And in many cases, when they do something that works and is proven, it becomes not a voluntary carbon activity, but part of the compliance market. And in our view, that's really what you want. And that's actually the genesis of the ETS. Like, New Zealand had voluntary carbon markets before it had the ETS. And many of the things that are now in the ETS had their start in voluntary carbon markets. And it's basically a really great incubator where you can find what's missing from the compliance framework, figure out a solution, prove it, and then push to get it incorporated into a broader framework that can be scaled up. So into voluntary claims and markets, because these are what many businesses actually like. Compliance, you don't get a choice, you just have to do it. Like, you can vote, and I encourage people to vote for strong compliance carbon markets because they're a big part of the solution. But in the voluntary sector, you don't have to. It's your choice, your decision to make a contribution to try and help us decarbonize faster. And essentially the equation that everyone's trying to solve, whether it's in the voluntary sector or in the compliance sector, is to get this number to this equation to zero. So you've got your emissions, you take away all of your removals, which is emissions are greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, removals of greenhouse gases being sucked out of the atmosphere, and then offsets, which is an increasingly controversial category, which is like that you apply against what's left, and you get your net position. If you can get this to be zero, especially if you do it without offsets, then you're net zero. That's the goal. That's the goal for now. Then we want to get net negative, but let's start with zero. There's sort of a bunch of key standards bodies, which are the foundations on which these frameworks are built. One is the International Standards Organization, which has a couple of key standards. There are others. I'm not going to exhaustively list them here. These are largely like the nuts and bolts, like core accounting mechanics. Then there's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which there's also multiple different standards. These in many cases are sort of like a superset of the International Standards Organization standards, and they set sort of broader frameworks as well as some principles and guidance on application. Then SBTI, it's something which, if you're closely involved in the space, you'll have heard a lot recently, Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is really more about not so much how you do your accounting, though there's increasingly a part of that, but the goals that you should set in order to be sort of sufficiently ambitious in where you're getting to with your accounting. So SBTI might say, for example, you should be at net zero by 2030. ISO and GHG define what net zero means. And then finally, the ICBCM, Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, they are sort of a relatively recently created organization that looks to set some kind of globally accepted standards and principles about what an offset is and the market principles that should apply to the trade of offsets and the application of offsets. But within the category of offsets and sort of the things which can be removals or offsets, there's two quite clearly distinct elements. Avoidance offsets and reduction offsets are basically units that are issued in recognition of something that you refrained from doing. So if you don't chop down a tree that you could have chopped down, you might get an avoided emission unit. If you don't build a coal power plant that you could have built, or you knock down a coal power plant that was there, you might get an avoided emission unit or a reduced emission unit. These are actually the majority of offsets that exist within the voluntary carbon market. There's like a lot of statistics on it's around about 90%. But the kind that are actually most useful for net zero are carbon removals. And they represent carbon that is freshly removed from the atmosphere. So it's not, I mean, arguably, if you've got a big forest, then it was removed over the last 100 years. But what we want is new ongoing removals. And for the most part, these come from forestry or direct air capture, but there's a lot of other potential, like regenerative agriculture can do it, accelerated rock weathering can do it, some classes of sort of blue carbon, like seaweed harvesting can do it. We really should be not looking to kind of pick one solution over another, but rather hold them all to a high standard of make sure that it's real, make sure that it's durable, it's not just sucked down one day and then it goes away the next, make sure that it's accurate, and some other points I'll get to later on. Increasingly, because so many of these offsets are avoided emission offsets, which don't really get us to net zero, and as I'll show in a moment, a lot of entities are looking to get their net position to zero without using offsets and by focusing on removals. And this is where I'm on slightly thinner ground, but my understanding is that the Science-Based Target Initiative actually requires this. You are not on track for your SBTI unless you have a pathway to reach net zero through the neutralization of any residual emissions using removals. Offsetting your emissions with avoided emissions elsewhere doesn't count. And there's an important reason for that. That this is sort of the contrast of net zero, which is all of your emissions are neutralized, versus carbon neutral, which is sort of all of your emissions have been offset through somebody else's absence of emissions. And the reason for this is that, let's say you've got 10 megatons of emissions per year from some activity, and you neutralize those with 10 megatons of carbon removals. Like you've still got your emissions, but you've sucked out of the atmosphere an amount of greenhouse gases equal to that emissions. Now the Earth is happy. Not happy, it would rather it was negative. It was rather it didn't have 50 degrees in north of Tunisia, but it's in a pretty good state. The net impact on the atmospheric CO2 concentration through your portfolio of activities is now zero. Contrast this with avoided emissions, which is really you've taken your 10 megatons of emissions, and you're kind of saying that you're offsetting those with somebody else's absence of 10 megatons of emissions that they might otherwise have created. Like that, this is what most carbon neutral claims using avoided emission offsets actually amount to. And clearly this is not going to lead to a happy planet. Like the consequence of this portfolio of activities is that we've still got an extra 10 megatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we've still got a pretty upset world. So you'll often hear the phrase, which has almost become a call to arms now, we can't offset our way to zero. That is very true if you are talking about avoided emission offsets or reduced emission offsets. However, you can neutralize your way to zero. And that is probably, per all of those UN forecasts, that's the way that we're going to get to zero as soon as we need to get to zero. Right, now on to native forests. And I better just check that I'm not running wildly out of time. Oh, that's about on track. Here's an example of the sort of the gap between what the compliance market provides in New Zealand and what the voluntary market provides in New Zealand at the moment. This is a customer we have on Banks Peninsula, so hopefully close at hand to B.Linc certainly, and some of you dialing in. And this is like it's a reserve. The entire thing is covenanted, and most of it is sort of early to mid-stage regenerating native forest. Pretty much the whole thing, aside from some grassland that you can see here. Unfortunately, only 37 hectares of it is actually of a status and history that makes it eligible for the ETS, despite the fact that all of it is still regenerating and removing carbon from the atmosphere. And that's just due to the sort of the combination of the ETS rules and the ETS challenges in assessment and proof of status. Unfortunately, that leaves 120 hectares of regenerating biodiverse native forest, so the exact kind of forest that we most want to encourage and protect and restore, which is ineligible for any incentives under the emissions trading scheme. Today, like there's very promising signs that could change, but at least that's the state today. This is one of the holes that I mentioned in the ETS. What we've been doing with this property is working with them to get their ETS areas registered in the ETS, and then their other areas registered for voluntary carbon removal units that they can then partner up with an organisation to neutralise their emissions. And that provides finance for the forest to allow it to continue to sequester carbon and sequester more carbon, because there's an incentive to sequester more carbon because you've got money coming when you do. So again, incentive and means are the key things you're looking for, and that will increase your removals, give you additional removals in the future. It's also extremely important with this to get your bookkeeping right. Like you don't want to be registering your ETS area for voluntary removals and double counting or double trading or double selling or anything like that. You have to be very careful to keep it all separated out, which is part of what the platform we've built delivers. And this allows this customer they work with the ETS for the ETS registered stuff, they work with an auditor for the non-ETS stuff, and they can sell these separate units of removals to ETS buyers or the tourism partner which they're working with. They could offset neutralize their internal operations. Or if they, like, let's say, for example, there was a primary sector, like a farming partner down the valley who was looking to neutralize their emissions, or even if they had their own farming activities on the grassland on the border of this property, they can neutralize those as well. So you can be quite you can pick and choose the activities that you undertake. The key thing is that you don't count any of your carbon removals twice, and you make sure that it's all accurate and durable and high quality and tracked. The result of this is that we're basically, we're not filling in all of the holes in the ETS by any means. There's a lot of other stuff there, and I'm very I wholeheartedly encourage some of the work that's being done in soil carbon and regenerative agriculture and direct air capture and all this kind of thing like that stuff. We need all of that. It desperately needs support. But we're filling in a couple of the gaps for native forest. And that unlocks incentives for the landholders, which means that we get more native forests restored, which means that more carbon incentives start to come into play, which means that there's less carbon in the atmosphere. Like these are the cycles that you want to try and create, in my view, using the voluntary carbon market. And if you do it well and you can prove it, then ideally it ends up in a compliance carbon market as well. And that's when it really starts to get to scale, because the compliance market is where the bulk of the funds and the money is. So the carbon removals that we're creating through these voluntary mechanisms, like they do remove carbon. That's one of the key criteria. We only issue units for carbon removals, not for avoided emissions or reduced emissions. You can only use them once. We track them on a registry to ensure that. They're permanent. We set a durability obligation of 100 years. They're transparent. This is all available in a publicly facing tool that we provide, where any given unit has an ID. You can query for it. You can trace them. They're accurate. We present the methodology by which it's calculated, and they can be certified as removals under ISO 1464-1, which is pretty key, because you want to be able to make these claims in connection with an overall business objective, because the business is like effectively donating money to that activity, and the benefit for them is that they get to make a particular claim in connection with it. And the result is that you can get to a net zero status, but you can do it in a way that provides a stronger story than some other forms of carbon neutrality using, say, international offsets from some renewable energy project, and that you've removed carbon, you've supported native forests, you're generally, with a massive co-benefit, supporting native biodiversity as well through your carbon payments. You can often act locally, like this forest may well be proximate to your actual business. And this actually also has international potential for New Zealand as an export, which is seen in the next example, where we worked with New Zealand Merino and Lake Hawea Station to provide to all birds a net zero shoe. And the key thing, like they've called this moonshot, they wanted to do it without offsets. And that doesn't mean without removals, obviously. It's not a gross emission zero shoe, but they wanted all of the emissions of that shoe to be neutralized with removals that occurred within the shoe's supply chain. So for that, you need to be very careful that you don't count the removals anywhere else as well. Fortunately for Lake Hawea Station, we know exactly where all of their ETS forest is registered because we manage it for them, which means that when we were looking at the removals we could use to support all birds' claim, we could explicitly exclude all of the ETS stuff and make sure nothing was counted twice. You'll see a lot of this area here. It looks like a weird thing to be including in a recognition of carbon removals because it's all sort of alpine grassland. The reason that we allow the polygons to be drawn like this is that it makes administration of the registration much easier. But you can see down the bottom, this is actually the carbon removals that the vision model is awarding to the land. So this is where the AI really comes in. It's not recognizing any carbon sequestration on any of these upper slopes. It knows that all that's there is grass and that it's basically not growing. It's only rewarding removals to the areas of vegetation that are growing and are not in the ETS. And in this case, we issued 2,500 individual tokens for that, each representing a ton of CO2 equivalent removed and durably stored in regenerating native forest. Each of these has a unique ID and a location, and they can be tracked using a tool that we have that's publicly taken back to the area of the farm that they came from, so that anybody can go and review and check its history and make sure that it's still there and that it hasn't been sold to anybody else. All of this requires a whole heap of sort of issuance tracking and ownership tracking and transaction monitoring, which we provide within our systems, and we also look to integrate with other registry providers in this space to make sure that sort of it's not really our ambition to be a marketplace. We've been working in the case of the property that I showed before, we're working with Carbon Z, which was the marketplace that the trades went through. And like we just look to enable the landholder to bring their supply to the market for whichever buyer they're looking to work with or whichever internal goals they happen to have. So sort of final comment, if you're looking to make a voluntary claim, like the ETS is actually very good at creating and supplying carbon removals. That's what all of the post-89 forest, when you get a post-89 NZU within the ETS, that represents a ton of carbon durably removed from the atmosphere. I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing to be using those NZUs in your voluntary carbon claims. Like it's probably, on balance, I'd say it's certainly better than doing nothing. But really, I think the thinking with any voluntary market activity should be look to fill the gaps that are in the compliance market. Like if a certain activity is already well served by the compliance market, you can chip in there as well, but you're already paying for, like, there's roughly $2 to $3 billion a year that we collectively are paying into the ETS to buy various sources of auctioned NZUs or removal NZUs from forestry. I think you're probably going to get the most value from your dollar if you focus on filling the gap, like find something that the ETS isn't effective for, and then use that to underwrite your neutrality claims that you're looking to make, rather than just kind of doubling up on something that's already got a market like forestry NZUs. Now, I should qualify. This may change in terms of the impact with some of the future ETS reforms. Like if the markets are split, there's no longer a viable market for forestry NZUs, the market price isn't high enough to support native restoration or something like that, then the equation changes. This is just sort of how we sort of see the landscape today. And all of this together, like if you're a business working in the space, this is what gets you on your path to carbon net zero at an individual business level. The sort of the key parts are reduce your emissions as much as you can. Like there's phrases that are often thrown around like wherever possible. Like if you've got enough money, almost anything's possible. It's really wherever economically viable, I think, is what the refrain should be. And a good guide for economic viability is how much can you increase your removals? Because if you reduce your emissions and you're getting to net zero, anything that you've got to pay left over, you've got to pay for with removals. And these are increasingly scarce, and they'll get more scarce as more people increase their ambitions. So it's really in your own selfish economic interest, quite aside from being the best thing from the planet, to figure out everything you can viably do to reduce your emissions and then do it. And then source removals that are the best removals that you can, supporting the best actions that are aligned with your goals that you can, and look to get this to zero. If you can, like, I think in a perfect world, the distinction between removals and offsets would go away. We would like to see the only form of offset be a removal offset. We're not there yet. I don't think it's going to happen in the short term. I wouldn't go so far as to say that all offsets are bad. I think that there are some project developers who are fantastic and they're doing really good work. The challenge is that it's sometimes quite hard to tell the difference between those and the terrible ones. And there's a lot of stuff historically in the market that's really pretty much junk, as a lot of the reporting in The Guardian earlier this year revealed that 90% of Vera's units they raised questions about. So yeah, get to net zero. And a final request, just generally, compliance, carbon markets are probably going to be the thing that saves us. Support them, work to understand, well, I won't just say support them, understand them. Like, hopefully, once you understand them, you'll see how they work and you'll support them. But my only real request is just understand them, because we think they're critical and we want to see them thrive and grow. That's me.